Well, it's finally time, guys. After 3 years looking back on all 19 current entries in the Tales series, I am finally in a position to make a definitive ranking list of all the games, from the worst to the best. In this list, I will strictly be staying with the original releases of each game, so no Tales of Destiny PS2 or the Vita R games. I do plan to eventually cover all the remakes, so stay tuned to a later ranking video with the remakes included. But as for now, I want to stick with the 19 original games. Now when it comes to ranking these titles, I found it quite hard to necessarily put one title above another. The series has, for the most part, had a pretty solid level of quality between the titles, so it's no surprise that there are some entries that are on par with one another. Thus for this list, I'm going to tier the list alongside ranking them. While I might put one game above another, if they are in the same tier, understand that I somewhat can go either way with the ranking depending on how I'm feeling. So without further ado, let's dive into the D tier games. The D tier, the bottom of the barrel when it comes to Tales games. These are the games that, following my retrospective of them, I really have no intention to ever come back and play. So let's get into what in my opinion is the worst Tales game ever made. Oi, I said no spin-offs. There are Tales games with bad stories, there are Tales games with horrible gameplay. There is only one that has both of these in droves, and that is Tales of Symphonia Dawn of a New World. From the get-go, it's clear as day that this game was made to cash in on fans of the original Tales of Symphonia, which, as we'll see later on, isn't me. When you remove the game's fan service, you're left with two of the most unlikable protagonists in a mediocre adventure that was an absolute chore to finish. If the game's story wasn't lame enough, you also had to deal with this game's extremely sloppy combat system. Both Emil and Marta love to flail off into space with their attacks, thus making nailing down combos a challenge. If I can give this game credit for one thing, it has to be the somewhat entertaining villains like Alice, Dex and especially Richter. However, their limited appearance on screen is unable to save this poor excuse of a sequel. Now, I might arguably be Tales of the Tempest's biggest defender, but even I have to acknowledge that this game sucks. From its clunky UI to its poor excuse of a combat system to the fact that the game's story is extremely bare bones. But hey, it's only 10 hours? Look, I loved Dints for at least trying to make a solid Tales game, unlike the lame cash grab that was Dawn of a New World. There are so many great ideas in this game which could have worked so well if we ever got a Tales of the Tempest R, but alas, we never did get that, and as such I must face reality and put this game right here, just one off the bottom of the list. Now this game's ranking might surprise you, but the reality is in the modern day, the original Super Famicom release of Tales of Phantasia is not really that good. Don't get me wrong, without this game there wouldn't even be a Tales series, but since its inception the series has gone far beyond what this game did. The story is pretty darn generic, and for all the talk of its real-time combat system, it still boils down to a game of having the best stats and using the right spells, just like any other JRPG of the time. There really isn't much of a reason to come back to this game outside of seeing where the series began. Sure, I enjoyed the game for what it was, but I highly doubt I'll ever touch it again. Speaking about the old games which I'll likely never touch again, the original Tales of Destiny. While this game is in most ways a clear step up over Phantasia, it still plays with a lot of the old school game designs that the series has long since abandoned. Combat is still that clunky one hit at a time affair, and the game visually looks like a SNES game despite being on the PlayStation 1. Also, this game has Chelsea, whose only redeeming factor is the fact that she doesn't have a voice actor in this game. Look, I know this was a game that likely introduced a lot of you to the Tales series, but as we'll see later on, Tales can be a lot better on the PlayStation 1. Okay, we're done with the D tier games, now onto the C tier games. These are the games which are alright. While these games aren't amazing, I still had mostly an enjoyable time playing them, to the point where I might consider coming back to them if I'm in the right mood. So let's dive into this tier with a game that I suspect a lot of you thought was going to be at the bottom of my list. Look, for all the hate I give this game, Tales of Arise is far from being the worst game associated with the Tales series. While I hate its battle system, it's still a step up from the broken and clunky battle systems of the previously mentioned games. Plus the story is pretty solid. Sure, it's not a conventional Tales plot, and it does go a bit off the rails near the end, but I was still entertained. However, while it's not the worst game in the series, it's still a game with some of the most unnecessarily long boss fights, and a game which trashes on the series' legacy in so many ways, and for that it's staying right here at the bottom of C tier. Man, I wish I wasn't ranking Eternia this low, because arguably it's the best of the classic Tales games. Finally, we have an engaging battle system, since we can now unleash combos, and visually we now have a game which actually looks like it should be on the PlayStation 1 instead of the SNES. However, Eternia suffers from being a super forgettable game, mostly due to Tales of Symphonia coming out 3 years later and totally surpassing this game in almost every way. Eternia unfortunately doesn't have a story which really sticks in the mind of the player, even with its horny anime adaptation. And despite a great bunch of side content, it really can't compete with the bigger adventures of the later games. The black sheep of the 6th gen Tales games. Legendia never really stood a chance of being a great Tales game, with it being made by a team of inexperienced developers under the control of a publisher who wanted to pump out as many Tales titles as possible. However, Legendia has its charm, which I think puts it above most other games in C tier. Like, name another Tales game which has a musical number. The setting of the Legacy is a really unique location compared to the wider Tales series, and the combat quirks like Senel being able to grab and throw enemies gives this game the edge over games like Tales of Eternia. However, it's still not exactly a great Tales game with its long drawn out dungeons and the fact that you need to basically play the game twice to finish the story. As a result, this game is kinda locked to C tier. You know, when I first played Tales of Innocence, I was blown away in the fact that I was able to play a full 3D Tales game on the Nintendo DS. And I initially thought Innocence was an A tier title. But as I got further into the game, it slowly dropped down to a B tier and then a C tier game. This can nearly all be attributed to two factors: the unnecessarily long dungeons and the ridiculous amount of super armor the late game enemies have. My goodness, when the regular enemies are more of a chore than the final boss, you know you've screwed up the combat system. Outside of these issues, Tales of Innocence is a surprisingly great game despite not being developed by the Namco Tales studio, and I'm very much looking forward to trying out the R remake sometime this year. Okay, now we're getting to the actually good Tales games with the B tier entries. These are the games I generally had a really good time playing, despite not necessarily blowing me away with their story and combat. And to start the B tier, we have a game which generally surprised me how much I enjoyed to play it. After being quite disappointed in its Vita remake, I was generally surprised by how much I loved playing Tales of Hearts on the Nintendo DS. Out of all the DS Tales games, Hearts is the only game which I might possibly dive into again, especially if someone can get a full translation of the game. Lifebottle Productions, please? Unlike the other DS Tales games, Hearts plays to the console's strengths, giving us a simple yet robust combat system that is also a blast to play. And while the story is not much to write home about, I found it engaging enough, and the ending is pretty solid, which might surprise you to find is kinda rare in the wider Tales series. And now we have what is in my mind the most overrated Tales game. Don't get me wrong, Tales of Symphonia is a bloody good game. It brilliantly transitioned the series into 3D while keeping true to the linear motion combat system, unlike a certain recent entry, and the story is arguably one of the best in the series. However, it's a game which has been simply outclassed by the entries which have succeeded it. Its combat has been outdone by the likes of Abyss and Vesperia. Meanwhile, its field exploration has been outdone by games like Graces and, I can't believe I'm going to say this, Arise. Today, Symphonia is just an okay Tales game, be it one which had an important impact on the series' visibility, but also one that simply cannot compete with the modern entries. Speaking about those modern entries, why the heck do fans hate on this game so much? While far from a perfect game, I had a blast with Tales of Zestiria. Sure, it's kind of generic with its very clear-cut good guys and bad guys, and Sorey isn't exactly a brilliant protagonist. However, I really resonated with his childlike belief that good people can fix a broken world, and it's a really heartwarming story in an age where a lot of JRPGs have moved into really dark and gritty plots. Outside of its story, Zestiria has a pretty solid combat system. Unlike that certain recent entry, Zestiria gives the player a bunch of ways to deal with tough opponents through the blast gauge and armatization, and while the skill system is a bit too cumbersome to fully utilise, it was still a nice inclusion. I strongly recommend that new fans give this game a try and not be put off by all the negative publicity around the game, because it sure as heck does not deserve it. Finally finishing up the B tier, I cannot express how excited I was to dive into the Japanese exclusive Tales games. To play a game which most other Tales fans had never touched definitely made me feel special, and Tales of Destiny 2 most certainly didn't disappoint. Tales of Destiny 2 remains in my mind the only sequel to exceed its predecessor, and by quite a margin if you look at where I put the first Destiny game. As a veteran of the Tales series, Destiny 2 felt like the ultimate test of skill in which I had to put all of my Tales combat knowledge to the test in order to get through this game's hard fights, and oh boy were they hard fights. Barbatus' third fight and the 20 attempts I made to try and beat him still remain etched in my mind to this day. While Destiny 2, like Symphonia, is another Tales game held back simply by being old and outdated, it still remains a solid entry which I cannot wait to dive into again when the full English translation comes out, which, on that topic, Lumia Tales, what's taking you guys so long? Okay, now we're hitting the A tier, with the games that are truly the best the series has to offer. From lovable casts to incredible combat systems, these are the quintessential games I recommend every Tales fan get around to trying, starting with... Quick cash grab or not, Tales of Xillia 2 is one of the series' best entries. While the game for the most part boils down to exploring the same world from the first game, Xillia 2 adds a bunch of content to, in many ways, make it a superior game to the original Tales of Xillia. From the new combat mechanics to all of Luga's different playstyles, Xillia 2 delivers a more content-rich game than Xillia 1. Story-wise, while its mission-based plot is strange, it's still better paced than Xillia. And while it's full of fan service, it's fan service for one of my favourite Tales games, so heck if I'm complaining. Also, I must stress how this might be one of the best games to play multiplayer, due to its shortened main story, meaning you and your friends don't have to find 40 hours of free time to play a Tales game. So while Xillia 2 might have been a simple asset swap, it's still one of the series' top entries. As I said in this game's retrospective, I was really excited to play it, and finally playing it, I can see why Tales of Rebirth is a game that desperately needs to be localised so Westerners can finally see why this game is so incredible. And that's not because it's the one with the furries.
Oh no, he's hot!
Rebirth has a combat system unlike any other game in this series, with arts being enhanceable and running off a cooldown system instead of relying on TP or CC. It also can't ignore the game's 3-line combat system, which gives us the perfect blend of 2D and 3D combat. Even outside of the combat, Rebirth delivers an incredible story around the breakdown of society across ethnic lines and the struggles to prevent conflict. If you can only spare time for one Japanese exclusive Tales game, please make it this one, as you will not be disappointed. To this day, I still don't understand people who put this game below Symphonia, because Tales of the Abyss is a superior game in almost every way. While Symphonia brought the series into 3D, Abyss actually gives us a 3D battle system thanks to the introduction of Freerun, which is awesome because it's totally broken in this game. Abyss also gives us a great cast of characters, who are a blast to use in combat as well as watch in the cutscenes. To me, Tales of the Abyss is the perfect benchmark of what a good 3D Tales game should be, and I wish more of the modern entries took notes from it. Now Namco, where is that remake? Is it controversial to put this game so high up on the list? I acknowledge that Graces has its flaws. It's less visually impressive than the previous Vesperia, and its characters are weaker than most of the 6th gen Tales casts, despite being ironically hilarious.
But I was meant to be king! Ah!
However, it also has arguably the best combat system in the series. Unlike Arise, Grace's style shift linear motion battle system spices up the classic combat in a way that remains true to the series' tradition of player skill over character stats. The whole counter playstyle in combat kept me really engaged, even in the regular fights, let alone the boss fights. It's kinda hilarious how the team has tried to replicate Grace's battle system in most subsequent games, but has gotten diminishing returns each time. Phew, we're finally at the end of the list with my 3 S-tier Tales games. These are, in my opinion, the 3 greatest Tales games ever made. While in a lot of cases I find the quality of these games on par with the A-tier games, they just hit me in a different way, which got me way more invested than any of the A-tier games. This most certainly is the case when it comes to my first S-tier Tales game being... Tales of Xillia is a game which I acknowledge has a bunch of flaws due to it being a somewhat rushed game for the series' 15th anniversary. I can't exactly say what it is about this game, perhaps it's the entertaining cast or perhaps the unique story, but I get so invested into Judah Mueller's adventure regardless of the pacing issues. I also love the double raid linear motion battle system. Sure, it's somewhat spam heavy with the freedom it offers, but that freedom also lets you fight however you want, and the linked darts are a cool idea, even if they kind of ruin 4-player co-op. And while the world of Riesa Max here can often be long boring canyons, it also has some of the most incredible locations in the series, from the Mongolic-inspired towns of Arjul to arguably my favourite JRPG town in Fenmont. I also must mention how much I love the new character designs. While I love the Vesperia art style, the Xillia art style will always be my favourite, and getting UFO Table to do the game's cutscenes turned what might have been a rushed game into a game I cannot help but fall in love with. Generally, when it comes to a Tales game, story is often a second selling point behind the characters and gameplay. However, Tales of Phantasia is the game which breaks my ranking, as its story is so great I cannot put it any lower than second on this list. The fact that you're basically playing as the bad guys in a JRPG is such a unique concept that I haven't really seen done in other games. Also, as Tales' only solo female lead in a mainline game, Velvet Crow is arguably the best protagonist in the series. Even outside of Velvet, Phantasia has one of the greatest casts in the series, both in party members, villains, and even side characters. I have no idea how the team was able to craft such an incredible game within the span of 1 year. Well, actually I kinda do, because they kinda screwed up the combat system. But when the narrative is this good, I can enjoy any combat system. Except Arise. No good story can salvage that game's combat system. You know, it was really hard deciding which game should be at the top of my list. Between the 3 games up here, I really struggled in deciding which game I should put at the top, but as I slowly thought through it, I just had to admit, Tales of Vesperia is the best Tales game ever made. Vesperia marked the end of a 13-year project in which the Namco Tales studio continuously refined their craft from Tales game to Tales game to eventually perfect the classic Tales formula in a game so close to perfect they had to completely shake up the formula for the later games because there really wasn't any way to top it. Vesperia has almost everything you want in a Tales game, from a beautiful anime aesthetic that has aged like fine wine, to a great cast of characters, to a combat system which is easy to learn but has a ton of depth for the advanced player. Sure, while the story lacks a cohesive direction, when you have characters like Yuri frickin' Lowo as a protagonist, you don't care, because just watching him is all the plot this game needs.
It'll be 100 years before you can beat me.
Because you've lived a lot longer, right?
Not exactly.
As much as I love Xillia and Phantasia, I kind of wish we could have gotten another game in the Vesperia format, as there really isn't any other games in the series quite like it, and I want more of its evolved flex range linear motion battle system. And with that, we've finally reached the end of my list. It feels nice to top off this 3-year-long retrospective project with a good old ranking list. Feel free to leave your comments on my list, as I know I put games like Symphonia and Arise further down than most fans, and games like Xillia and Styria much higher up. So let me know about your rankings as well as which games I ranked terribly wrong. Until next time, I'll see you later.